Seo Yura learned early how to move quietly through expensive spaces. The marble floors of Kang Min-Jae's headquarters reflected her footsteps, but no sound ever followed. Men in tailored suits lowered their eyes when she passed. Assistants stood straighter. Conversations paused, not out of curiosity but out of caution. Everyone knew who she was, and yet no one truly did. She sat alone in the back of the private elevator, fingers folded neatly over her lap, watching the numbers descend. Penthouse to lobby, gold to glass, silence to noise. It had been like this for years. Proximity without contact, presence without possession. Kang Min-Jae never stood beside her. He watched from a distance. Always. She had never felt his hand on her arm. Never heard her name spoken softly. Never been summoned late at night or dismissed in the morning. In a world where men took what they wanted, Min-Jae did neither. That was the rule. She's his, people whispered. No, others corrected. She's untouched. Protection wrapped around her like invisible glass. She was escorted, guarded, anticipated, but never chosen. The kind of safety that keeps you intact while slowly erasing you. Yura stepped out into the Seoul evening, the city alive with headlights and quiet ambition. A black car waited at the curb as it always did. Not his. Never his. Just one of many that ensured she arrived and returned unharmed. For a long time she believed this was care. Then someone else spoke to her. Not in whispers. Not through intermediaries. Not with distance disguised as discipline. He stood in front of her, unafraid of the weight carried by her name. He looked at her, not as an extension of Kang Min-Jae's shadow, but as a woman standing on her own. I won't pretend you don't exist, he said. No permission was asked. No rules acknowledged. Across the room something shifted. The pause that usually followed Min-Jae's presence never came. Conversations continued. Laughter broke through. The world did not wait. From the far end of the hall, Kang Min-Jae noticed. For the first time in years, restraint did not feel like control. Felt like loss. And Seo Yura, standing where silence had always held her in place, did not step back. Seo Yura's days followed a rhythm that never belonged to her. She woke in rooms chosen for her, dressed in clothes delivered without notes, and moved through schedules arranged by people who never asked what she wanted. Everything fit perfectly. Nothing felt personal. The kind of life people mistook for privilege, because they never looked closely enough to see the emptiness inside it. She lived in a high-rise overlooking the Han River, the kind of place where the windows were soundproof and the silence pressed in at night. Security cameras blinked softly in corners she pretended not to notice. Guards rotated shifts without ever meeting her eyes. They bowed. They protected. They kept their distance. That distance was the rule. Kang Min-Jae had never said it aloud, but everyone understood. Seo Yura was not to be touched, questioned, or approached without cause. No gifts with hidden meanings. No lingering looks. No curiosity mistaken for courage. Men who forgot learned quickly. Not through threats. Min-Jae rarely needed those, but through absence. Invitations revoked. Businesses stalled. Names quietly erased from rooms they once dominated. Yura saw it happen more than once. At formal dinners, she sat 2 seats away from Min-Jae, always close enough to feel the gravity of his presence, never close enough to feel his warmth. He spoke little. When he did, the table listened. His gaze passed over her as it did everyone else. Calm, assessing, unreadable. Sometimes she wondered if that was worse than being watched. She had met him years ago, back when she still believed proximity meant importance. She was younger then, still learning how to stand straight under the weight of other people's expectations. Min-Jae had looked at her once, long enough to decide something she would never be told. From that moment on, her life rearranged itself around his silence. Protection came first. Choice never did. When she walked into a room, conversations softened, then resumed once she passed. Women studied her with curiosity edged in caution. Men looked once and looked away. not out of disinterest but out of understanding. She belonged to a space no one else was allowed to enter. And yet she belonged to no one. At night, Yura stood by the window and watched Seoul breathe. The city pulsed with lives unfolding freely. People choosing badly, choosing boldly, choosing at all. Below her, couples argued, laughed, held hands. Cars stopped and started without escorts. Mistakes were made without permission. She pressed her palm to the glass and felt nothing. Min-Jae never visited her apartment. Never summoned her unexpectedly. Never crossed the invisible line he himself had drawn. His control was precise, surgical. He gave her safety the way one might give shelter to something fragile, by never letting it experience the outside. Sometimes she caught his gaze across crowded rooms, fleeting and unreadable. In those moments, something tight coiled in her chest, not hope exactly, but the echo of a question she no longer allowed herself to ask. If he could protect her from everyone else, why couldn't he choose her? Years passed that way. Quiet, controlled, untouched. And Yura learned how to live inside the space between being wanted and being claimed, unaware that the world had already begun to notice the silence surrounding her. And that silence, once broken, would never return. Rules were never announced in Kang Min-Jae's world. They revealed themselves through absence. Seo Yura learned them the way one learns the shape of a dark room, by moving carefully and noticing what disappeared. A man who lingered too long at her side was reassigned within a week. A woman who asked questions about her schedule stopped receiving invitations altogether. Once, an executive reached for her elbow in a crowded corridor, a gesture so small it might have passed unnoticed anywhere else. By the next morning, his office was empty. His name was removed from internal directories as if it had never existed. No one explained. No one needed to. The rule was simple. Yura existed beyond reach. Min-Jae never enforced it publicly. He did not glare or threaten. He did not raise his voice or tighten his jaw. He continued as he always had. Calm, precise, devastatingly quiet. The consequences arrived later, detached from the moment that caused them. That was what made them effective. Yura became fluent in this language of omission. At events, she positioned herself where she could be seen but not engaged. She mastered polite distance, the half-smile that closed conversations before they began. When someone addressed her directly, they did so with careful neutrality, as if speaking to a boundary rather than a person. She answered softly, never too warmly, never too coldly. She did not want anyone to test the limits on her behalf. Sometimes she caught Min-Jae watching. Not intently, not possessively, but with the same measured attention he gave everything under his control. He never intervened in real time. He didn't need to. The system moved for him. That was the unspoken law. Nothing reached Yura without passing through him first. What unsettled her most was that Min-Jae never reminded her of it. He never warned her what would happen if she stepped outside the perimeter. He never framed it as protection. In his silence, there was an assumption, an expectation, that she would understand her place within the structure he'd built. And she did. Oh well. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when she wondered what would happen if she broke the rule herself. If she stayed too long in a conversation. If she laughed too openly. If she allowed someone to see her as something other than an extension of Min-Jae's shadow. The thought always ended the same way, with restraint. Not fear exactly, but responsibility. She had seen what disruption cost. And she had learned that Min-Jae's power did not react kindly to unpredictability, even when it came from her. So she complied without being asked. That was the cruel elegance of it. The rules required nothing from her except silence. No loyalty sworn. No promises made. Just acceptance. From the outside it looked like reverence. Inside it felt like containment. And Kang Min-Jae, architect of a world that bent around his will, never noticed the smallest crack forming. Not in his empire, but in the quiet space where Seo Yura had learned to disappear. Because rules without words are the hardest to break. And the most dangerous to believe will never be tested. Kang Min-Jae had built his power on distance. He learned early that proximity bred weakness. Men who stood too close mistook familiarity for permission. Men who touched what they valued lost the ability to think clearly when it was threatened. Control, he discovered, came from restraint, from knowing exactly how far to stand back and never crossing that line. Seo Yura was the clearest proof of that discipline. From the moment she entered his orbit, Min-Jae had drawn a boundary so precise it became doctrine. He did not touch her because touching led to possession, and possession led to exposure. Everything he was, everything he ruled, invited danger. Enemies did not need reasons, only leverage. And leverage was always human. So he kept her untouched. Not because he felt nothing but because he felt too much. Min-Jae watched Yura the way one watches a controlled burn. Alert, calculating, always prepared to intervene, but never interfering. He noticed the way she carried herself now, measured and contained, as if she were constantly bracing against an invisible weight. He noticed when her laughter softened at gatherings, when her gaze lingered on ordinary things. Streetlights, passing crowds, freedoms that meant nothing to people who had never been denied them. He told himself this was protection. If she remained untouched, she remained safe. If she was never claimed, she could never be used. In his mind, restraint was not neglect, it was strategy. The highest form of care a man like him could offer. What Min-Jae never allowed himself to examine was the cost of that strategy. He justified the silence easily. Words created expectations. Expectations created disappointment. He justified the distance more carefully. Distance kept her alive. Distance kept her clean of the violence that clung to him like a second skin. Distance meant that if the day ever came when someone came for him, Yura would be untouched by the fallout. That was the story he told himself. And like all carefully constructed narratives, it left things out. There were nights when Min-Jae stood alone in his office long after the city had gone quiet, watching Yura's apartment lights across the river. He never called, never sent for her, never crossed the invisible line he had set so long ago. He let the ache remain unnamed, unacknowledged. Wanting her, he believed, would make him reckless. Choosing her would make him human. And humanity was a liability he could not afford. So he settled for control without connection, presence without participation, power that governed everything around her, but never reached her directly. Min-Jae did not see this as failure. To him it was restraint perfected, proof that he could master even himself. He did not notice that restraint, stretched over years, begins to look less like discipline and more like absence. And absence, unlike violence, does not announce itself as a threat, until it has already taken something you never realized you were losing. He entered her life without announcement, not through guards or schedules or the quiet choreography that governed everything around Seo Yura, but through something disarmingly ordinary. A conversation that did not lower its voice when she approached. A gaze that did not flick away in practiced caution. A presence that did not ask the room for permission to exist. His name was Lee Seon-woo. He met her at a foundation board meeting Min-Jae did not attend, one of the few spaces where his shadow was felt but not visible. Seon-woo was younger than most men at the table. His suit impeccably tailored but unadorned. His manner calm without being deferential. He spoke clearly. He listened when others spoke. And when Yura offered a brief comment on a proposal, he turned toward her fully, as if her voice were not an interruption but the point. "That's a practical concern," he said, meeting her eyes. "Thank you for raising it." The table went quiet. Not because he had said anything wrong but because he had said it directly. To her. Without caution. Without checking the room. Yura felt the stillness before she understood it. Years of instinct tightened her shoulders, prepared her to soften the exchange, to close the door she had learned to guard so carefully. But Seon-woo didn't retreat. He didn't press either. He simply waited, unbothered by the silence his attention had created. Later, as the meeting dissolved into smaller conversations, he found himself beside her again. No escort intervened. No signal arrived to redirect him. He spoke as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "You don't say much," he observed, not unkindly. "I say enough," Yura replied. A faint smile touched his mouth. Enough for who? The question lingered longer than it should have. Seo was not reckless. Yura sensed that immediately. He was careful but not afraid. The difference unsettled her more than boldness ever could. He asked about her work, her interests, her thoughts on things unrelated to the world Min-Jae controlled. He listened as if the answers mattered, not as if they were being weighed for consequence. When they parted, he did not ask for her number. He did not promise anything. He simply said, "I hope we speak again," and meant it. They did. At another event, another conversation. Each time the rules bent slightly, not because Seo pushed them, but because he never acknowledged they existed. He did not look over his shoulder. He did not lower his voice. He did not signal challenge. He chose presence. Word traveled as it always did. Not as gossip but as curiosity. Min-Jae heard about him in fragments. A name mentioned twice in the same week. A report that lingered a moment too long on an insignificant detail. He dismissed it at first. Men came and went. Interest faded. The structure held. Until one evening, Min-Jae saw it for himself. Across a crowded hall, Seo Yura stood with Lee Seo at her side. Not behind her. Not in front of her. Beside. They were not touching. They did not need to. The ease between them was unmistakable. And for the first time in years, someone stood close to what Min-Jae had never claimed. Without fear, without permission, and without waiting. Something cold settled in his chest. Because Seo was not challenging him. He was simply choosing her. And in that quiet decision, Kang Min-Jae felt the first real tremor in the empire. He believed Restraint had made unbreakable. Seo Yura did not change all at once. The shift began in small, almost imperceptible ways. Moments she might have ignored if she had not spent years training herself to notice everything. She found herself speaking without first calculating who might be listening. She allowed her gaze to linger when Lee Seo addressed her, instead of softening it into neutrality. She stayed a few minutes longer at events, even when instinct told her it was safer to leave early. Nothing dramatic happened. No rule was broken outright. But something inside her loosened. Seo never demanded space in her life. He offered it. When he invited her to lunch, he did not frame it as an obligation or a favor. "If you're free," he said. "If you want." The words landed softly, almost unfamiliar. Want had never been part of her vocabulary. She said yes before she could talk herself out of it. They sat in a quiet restaurant overlooking the river, far from the guarded rooms she knew so well. No security hovered nearby. No one watched from corners. Seo asked her what she liked to read, what kind of mornings she preferred, whether she ever wanted to leave the city. Questions without strategy. Attention without calculation. Yura answered cautiously at first, then more freely as the minutes passed. She heard herself laugh, an unguarded sound that surprised her enough to make her pause. Seo noticed, not with triumph, but with warmth, as if this were exactly who he had expected her to be. When he looked at her, it was not with possession or reverence. It was recognition. That night, standing alone in her apartment, Yura felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not excitement, not fear. Relief. The quiet kind that comes from finally being seen without conditions. She thought of Min-Jae then, as she often did. Of the years spent within his careful perimeter. Of the safety that had cost her her voice. For the first time, the thought did not tighten her chest with guilt. It simply existed alongside the new awareness growing inside her. At the next event, she arrived without rehearsing her exits. When Seo greeted her, she did not step back. She did not scan the room for reactions. She stayed. People noticed. Whispers changed tone. Curiosity sharpened. The stillness that usually followed her movements fractured into something restless. Yura felt it and did not retreat. She held Sian-woo's gaze as he spoke, as if anchoring herself to the present instead of the rules that had defined her past. Across the room, Kang Min-Jae watched. He saw it in the way Yura stood, less guarded, more certain. In the way she no longer seemed to disappear into the space around her. Something had shifted, and it had not been taken from her. She had accepted it. Attention. Presence. Things she had never been given. And once accepted, they could not be returned. Yura understood that now, even as she felt the quiet thrill of stepping into a version of herself she had never been allowed to imagine. What she did not yet understand was how deeply this acceptance would unsettle the man who had built her world on silence, and how quickly restraint would begin to feel like loss. Kang Min-Jae did not react at first. Reaction implied surprise, and he refused to grant the situation that power. He observed instead the way he always had. From a distance, from above. Reports came in quietly, threaded through routine briefings and incidental remarks. Seo Yura attended more functions, left later, spoke more. Her name surfaced alongside Lee Sian-woo's often enough to stop sounding coincidental. Min-Jae told himself it meant nothing. People mistook proximity for significance all the time. Interest faded. Patterns corrected themselves. The structure held because it always had. But the structure had never accounted for choice. He began to notice what was missing. Yura no longer glanced instinctively toward the doors when she entered a room, as if measuring her exits. She no longer positioned herself where she could disappear easily. When she spoke, people listened, not because of him but because of her. That distinction unsettled him more than defiance ever could have. There was no single moment when Min-Jae realized he was losing something. Loss did not announce itself with alarms or confrontation. It arrived quietly, in the spaces where silence used to be enough. He stood at the edge of a gala floor one evening, watching Yura across the room. She was listening to Sian-woo, her posture open, her attention unguarded. Not careless. Intentional. Min-Jae felt the familiar impulse to step forward, to reclaim the balance by sheer presence. He did not move. Restraint had always been his answer. But for the first time, restraint did not feel like control. Felt like delay. And delay, he realized too late, was indistinguishable from surrender. Min-Jae returned to his office that night and stood alone in the dark, city lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass. He replayed years of decisions. Every moment he chose silence over clarity, distance over declaration. He had believed that by never claiming Yura, he preserved her freedom. Now he saw the flaw in that logic. Freedom unacknowledged does not wait. Someone else will step into the space you refuse to occupy. The realization did not arrive as anger. It arrived as weight. Heavy and immovable. A truth settling into place where certainty once lived. He had protected her from the world, but never from loneliness. He had kept her safe, but never chosen. And she had stopped waiting. Min-Jae understood then that power which never reaches becomes irrelevant. That restraint, when carried too far, transforms into absence. And absence invites replacement. Across the city, Yura was learning how it felt to exist without asking permission. And Kang Min-Jae, feared by men who trembled at his name, stood motionless in his own silence, confronted by the one consequence his power could not undo. He had waited. And the waiting had cost him everything that could not be reclaimed by force. Kang Min-Jae had solved every problem in his life the same way. He applied pressure. Call placed at the right hour. A meeting arranged before resistance could form. Doors closed, paths redirected. Outcomes decided long before anyone realized a decision had been made. Power moved fastest when it moved quietly. And Min-Jae had mastered that language. This time it did nothing. He summoned reports he did not need. Asked questions whose answers changed nothing. Lee Sian-woo was clean, too clean. No leverage worth using. No hidden debts, no careless alliances. No fear that could be applied without consequence. He existed outside the familiar map of Min-Jae's influence, and that alone was unsettling. Min-Jae considered intervening directly. One appearance would be enough. A look, a pause in conversation, the subtle reminder of who controlled the room. He imagined stepping between them, reasserting the order everyone understood without explanation. And then he imagined Yura's face. Not startled, not afraid, disappointed. The thought stopped him. For the first time, Min-Jae hesitated not because of risk, but because of meaning. Power could separate them easily. He could make Seon-woo disappear from her proximity without leaving a trace. But what would that prove? That he could still control the perimeter. Not that he mattered within it. He realized then that the thing he wanted could not be taken without destroying it. Attention, once freely given, could not be reclaimed through force. Choice, once exercised, could not be undone without cost. Min-Jae watched from a distance as Yura moved through a room filled with voices and light. She no longer searched for him instinctively. Her awareness had shifted outward, toward the present, toward possibility. She belonged to herself in a way she never had before. And that was something his power had never been able to create. He stood still while others moved around him. His reputation towering and suddenly useless. Years of discipline had taught him when to strike, when to wait. But no rule had prepared him for the moment when waiting became the threat. Min-Jae understood now that emotion delayed does not pause. It moves on without you. That restraint, once admired, could curdle into regret. For the first time in his life, Kang Min-Jae faced a problem that could not be solved by command or consequence. He had to speak. And speaking meant exposing something he had spent years burying beneath silence. As the room shifted and Yura turned slightly, her laughter carrying briefly across the space, Min-Jae felt the full weight of his hesitation settle into his chest. Power could bend the world. But it could not undo the time he had already lost. And the most dangerous man in Korea remained where he was, watching, silent, and painfully aware that the moment he needed control the most was the moment it could no longer save him. Min-Jae chose a moment that was already slipping away. It was late, after an event had thinned into polite goodbyes and lingering conversations. The room no longer waited for him the way it once had. People moved freely now, orbiting their own interests. Yura stood near the windows, the city lights reflecting softly in the glass. Her posture relaxed in a way he had not seen before. He approached without announcement. She sensed him before she turned. Years of awareness did not vanish overnight. But when she faced him, there was no instinctive retreat, no careful calculation. Only composure, only distance. "Yura," he said. Her name sounded unfamiliar in his mouth, as if unused from disuse rather than neglect. She inclined her head slightly. Respectful. Neutral. "You wanted to speak to me?" she asked. The question landed heavier than any accusation. Wanted. As if intent required clarity. As if silence had not always sufficed. Min-Jae stood still, words arranged carefully behind his teeth, each one weighed and discarded in turn. He had rehearsed none of this. Power had never required rehearsal. But this was not power. This was something else, and it left him unarmed. "I have always ensured your safety," he said finally. Yura nodded once. "I know. I kept you separate from my world. I know." Her calm unsettled him more than anger would have. It offered no resistance to push against, no emotion to overpower. "There were reasons," he continued, his voice low. "Things you didn't need to carry." For the first time, something flickered across her expression. Not pain, not resentment, but recognition. As if she had already walked this path alone and reached its end without him. "You never asked if I wanted to carry them," she said quietly. The words were simple. They cut cleanly. Min-Jae felt the weight of years settle into the space between them. All the moments he had withheld. All the questions he had never asked because the answers might have required him to change. "What do you want now?" Yura asked. The word echoed like an accusation. He realized then the truth he had avoided for too long. He did not know what she wanted. He had never known. He had assumed, protected, decided. But he had never asked. And now asking felt like intrusion. Min-Jae searched her face for something familiar. Dependence, hesitation, the quiet patience he had mistaken for waiting. He found none of it. Only resolve. Only a woman standing in her own choosing. "I wanted to understand," he said, knowing even as he spoke that it was insufficient. Yura held his gaze, steady and unafraid. "You had years." Silence stretched between them, vast and irreversible. In it, Min-Jae understood what had been lost, not through betrayal or defiance, but through neglect disguised as care. "I won't disappear," she said softly. "But I won't step back either." She did not ask his permission. She turned away then, rejoining the room, her presence seamless and complete. Min-Jae remained where he was, surrounded by people who no longer waited for his signal. For the first time, Kang Min-Jae understood the cost of never asking the one question that mattered, until the answer no longer belonged to him. The story did not end with a confrontation. It ended with a recalibration. In the weeks that followed, Kang Min-Jae's world continued to move. Meetings held, deals closed, alliances maintained. His name still carried weight. Doors still opened. Men still measured their words in his presence. From the outside, nothing appeared altered. But power had shifted its shape. Seo Yura no longer moved within the careful choreography built around her. She appeared where she chose. She left when she wished. Sometimes she was seen with Lee Seon-woo, sometimes alone. Always unescorted. Always visible. The whispers that once defined her faded, replaced by something harder to dismiss. Recognition. She was no longer untouchable because of Min-Jae. She was untouchable because she had chosen herself. Min-Jae watched this transformation with a clarity that bordered on pain. He did not interfere. Interference would have proven what he already knew. That control could not reclaim what silence had surrendered. The world adjusted slowly as it always did. His authority remained intact, but its center had shifted inward, forcing him to confront what remained when fear was no longer the currency. For the first time, Min-Jae understood that legends are not undone by defeat. They are altered by restraint that arrives too late. He had built his reputation on mastery. Of others, of systems, of himself. But mastery without presence had cost him the one thing power could not replace. The loss did not weaken him in the eyes of the world. Changed him in ways no one else could see. Seo Yura felt the change differently. There was grief, yes, but it was quiet, clean. Not for what had been taken from her, but for what had never been offered. Alongside it grew something steadier. Confidence. Ownership. The simple, radical act of choosing where to stand. When she thought of Min-Jae now, it was without bitterness. He had shaped her past through absence. She would not allow him to define her future the same way. One evening, standing at the edge of the city she had finally stepped into, Yura understood the truth that had eluded them both for years. Being untouched had never made her powerful. Being seen had. And Kang Min-Jae, watching the city from his own glass-walled height, finally accepted the lesson no enemy had ever taught him. Power that does not speak becomes irrelevant. Protection without choice becomes a cage. And restraint, once mistaken for virtue, can quietly turn into regret. The untouchable had been touched, not by force, not by fear, but by choice. And in that choice, a legend shifted. Not broken, altered forever.